Welcome to 843 TV. I'm now joined by Dr. Chester DePratter, who's the lead archaeologist here at the Santa Elena Foundation and also a professor of archaeology at the University of South Carolina. Dr. DePratter, Chester, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're here now in the beginning stages of the Santa Elena History Center. And you've got a little bit of a history with the Santa Elena site and the archaeology, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. But would you mind telling our viewers a little bit about your background and how you started in archaeology and what you're doing now?
Sure. Well, back when I started at the University of Georgia in the 60s, I was a biology major. And toward the end of my junior year, I decided to change to anthropology, which includes archaeology, and ended up getting my undergraduate degree and then continued on to graduate school there. So 1968 is when I first began studying archaeology, and after a short stint in the Coast Guard, I began doing archaeology on my own only a couple of years after I became an anthropology major. So since 1970, which is now, 46 years, I've been doing field archaeology, and it's all of it in Georgia and South Carolina, so pretty much local.
Okay, and speaking of local archaeology, how long have you been working on the Santa Elena site here in Beaufort County?
Well, as a graduate student at the University of Georgia, I worked with Professor Charles Hudson, who was very interested in tracing the routes of Spanish explorers in the interior of the Southeast in the 16th century. And through that, I developed a very strong interest in the whole 16th century question of the competition between France and Spain and England for this part of the world, where the Spanish explorers went through the interior in their efforts to understand this new land and find ideal place for settlements. So that when I came to South Carolina in 1984, I stepped away from that a little bit and began working on Indian populations that lived in the interior around Camden, South Carolina. And I did that for a couple of years, and then through my work with Stanley South, who was an archaeologist who began working here at Santa Elena in Beaufort County in 1979. He was a great colleague, was willing to share his site and his interest with me. And so in 1989, about 5 years after I came to South Carolina, we began a search for French Charles Fort, the French fort that preceded the Spanish by 4 years. And we didn't find it right away, but it was a great fun project coming to Beaufort, getting to run around and dig holes in a number of different places. And we ultimately did find the location of Charles Fort. But then after doing that for a couple of years, we were approaching the 500th anniversary of Columbus. And so I worked with the state legislature, and a Columbian Quincentennial Commission of South Carolina was established by the legislature, and I became chair of that commission. And through that, helped Stanley South get into the field and work at Santa Elena. And as head of that commission, I joined him at Santa Elena in 1991, and then we continued working on the site together until he retired several years ago. And it was a great project on a great site. So it was lucky that I fell into it. And it's led to the Santa Elena History Center ultimately.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. So what does make the Santa Elena site so unique from an archaeology perspective?
There are a number of things. The first is that it's a really important site in the history of this part of the world, because it's the northernmost Spanish settlement made as Spain moved into the New World and branched out in all directions, explored and settled the Caribbean, South America, Central America, and attempted to settle North America. And Santa Elena is the northernmost outpost of those efforts. It didn't succeed. It lasted only 21 years, but it represents a real moment in time when Philip II, King of Spain, was trying to claim this previously unsettled part of Spanish Florida. So he came, he was going to put missionaries early on up at Chesapeake Bay in 1570, after he established Santa Elena in 1566. He sent expeditions into the interior to open up an overland road to Mexico from here. He made Pedro Menendez, the founder of Santa Elena and Spanish Florida, made Santa Elena his capital in 1571 with the intent of bringing his family here and making this the capital.
Yeah.
So from its historical side, it's very important. From the archaeological side, it's a complete Spanish town preserved in the ground that has been carefully caretaken by the U.S. Marine Corps.
Yeah.
It was, you know, in plantation days, there were plantations there.
Right.
In 1918, the Marine Corps acquired the part of Parris Island that includes Santa Elena.
Okay.
And since then, they've protected it. It was a training base early on, and then later, after, that was in World War I, period where it wasn't used, then it became a golf course.
Right.
And so the golf course was active on top of Santa Elena until 2000. And so there's never been any major development. The site covers about 15 or 16 acres, so it's a fairly large area that is accessible and well maintained, and plus we have great security since the Marine Corps owns it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we don't have to worry about looters. So any other site of that period, anywhere in this area probably would have had development on it, condos or subdivisions or shopping centers. And it's just by happenstance that it's been in a place that it's been so well protected for so long. So it makes the archaeology ideal.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I have one of my good friends is a city archaeologist in St. Augustine, where the 16th century Spanish occupation is buried about 5 feet below the present ground surface. And that 5 feet is all rubble from collapsed buildings and old roadways and garbage. So, and the earlier 16th century has been chopped through by wells and post holes and ditches. So when my friend in St. Augustine wants to dig 16th century archaeology, he comes up here to work with me because it's almost inaccessible to him.
Wow.
So it's a major place, well preserved, and you know the amount of history preserved there is probably unmatchable for anything of the period anywhere nearby, at least.
Amazing. So, you know, can you describe some of the archaeology work that's been done so far at this site? I mean, was there something that you all found that kind of triggered a lot of excitement?
Well, all the way back into the 18th century, the site where Santa Elena is on Parris Island was a known place because there was a fort with a moat or a ditch standing open that had water. The locals in the 18th century, early 19th century thought it was French Charles Fort. It was built by Jean Ribault in 1562 and abandoned a year later. And so for a century and a half, Beaufort residents used to go over there and dig relics out of this fort, thinking it was Charles Fort. And it was believed to be Charles Fort even after a Marine did archaeology there in the 1920s, all the way up until 1957, when a St. Augustine archaeologist came up and looked at artifacts that had been taken out of that fort and said these are Spanish and not French. And so all along, historians in Florida had been saying this is Santa Elena, not Charles Fort, but it wasn't until 1957 that was confirmed. And then when Stanley South came to work here in 1979, one of the main problems he had was there's no map. So Pedro Menendez, the founder of Santa Elena and the founder of Spanish Florida, came here in 1566, built a fort, ultimately established a town, made it the capital, but we don't have a map.
Right.
So we've got 15 or 16 acres of town and 30-something acres of golf course on the side of the road where Santa Elena is. And so early on, the first efforts were to try to figure out exactly where the town is and to dig small 3-foot square holes and find out where the concentrations of materials are. Plus, when Stanley South came, he was told he couldn't dig on the golf course. So he had to dig on the wooded fringe and the space between the fairways rather than on the fairways. And so he started there, and through doing that, he found another Spanish fort that wasn't visible on the surface in his first week of archaeology here. He came out, dug a series of small holes, recognized the stains in the soil, tracked it out, and in 5 days' work, he'd identified a Spanish fort, which is pretty phenomenal in the world of archaeology. And then after that, he worked in the areas he could. He worked in the fort that had been previously thought to be Charles Fort, that was proved to be one of Santa Elena's forts. He found several buildings that turned out to be the home and adjacent buildings belonging to the second governor of Santa Elena, though we didn't know that at the time. Then when I joined him, we started digging smaller holes, closer spaced over the whole area, determine the exact size of the town, and through that we're able to find additional forts, additional residences. We found a pottery kiln that was made and used in the late 1580s by residents of Santa Elena. But it's always been go out and dig holes and just see what's there, because there's no map. We're beginning to think we know where the plaza is and where some roads are. We know where 2 forts are, but there were 5 Spanish forts in addition to the French Charles Fort.
Okay.
So there's still lots to find. And the future is going to be, the next step is going to be remote sensing, where we take machines and run them over the ground and they tell us what's buried there.
Cool.
So that we hope, if we can get permission from the Marine Corps at Parris Island for the summer, to go out and do the first major project to map the entire 16-acre town and confirm where we think the plaza is, confirm where we think another of the forts is located, begin to see the layout of all the wells that would have been dug for drinking water, which will help us figure out the lot system. And so we hope in one summer's work, we can create the map that Pedro Menendez wasn't considerate enough to make for us when he was here in the 16th century.
Very cool. Well, that is absolutely fascinating stuff. Chester, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And stick around for one more segment of 843 TV.